Welcome back. Now we're going to have Colin Pfaff with a plenary talk. Colin is a family medicine doctor who has worked in northern KwaZulu-Natal, in Nepal, and in Malawi. He's recently moved back to South Africa and is currently the project manager at MSF in Khayelitsha. He is passionate about rural health and medical missions. Over to you, Colin.
All right, thanks, Stuart, and hello, everybody. Nice to see some friends virtually, and also some friends from outside of South Africa. Very encouraging to see you guys. All right, I'm going to try and share my screen if I'm clever enough to do this. Okay. Also, thank you so much to Pastor Dlamuka for that first session. I think lots of what you said resonated with me, and I think you will see there's some parallel thoughts that I've also got, and sort of some, yeah, anyway, I think you'll see there's sort of some overlap here. So yes, I've been asked to speak in our theme about challenges in an uncertain world. And I think we have all had lots of uncertainties in our world in the last 5 months. And I'm aware that it's affected all of us in different ways. And there are, in fact, many different experiences. So I wanted to just share my own experience of growing in trusting God in this time of uncertainty, sharing a bit of some of the uncertainties that I've faced recently and what has helped me. So I think many of you know that I've been working in Malawi for the past few years. And indeed, I was in Malawi from January and sort of was there in March when the first sort of seriousness of the coronavirus pandemic sort of we started to realize what was going on. And I remember an early conversation at a meeting in Lilongwe where I think it was clear I was not taking this really seriously at all. I was at a meeting with other NGOs, about 10 other NGOs, and a friend who was working with a large American group told me that their NGO was at that point suspending all international travel, and they were no longer having any international meetings. This is long before there was, well, several weeks before there was any talk of lockdown. And I was really quite surprised. And I said to her, I mean, really? I found it quite hard to take all this seriously. That was my words to her. And she said to me at the time, no, this is big. This is really big. And I remember leaving that meeting and driving back to the town where I was staying, sort of not really convinced and thinking that it sounded somewhat like an overreaction to me. So the next week, we were due to have another internal meeting in the organization that I was working for, again in the capital, Lilongwe. That's about 3.5 hours drive from the hospital where I was working. And this particular meeting was one that I was dreading. I had several difficult conversations earlier in the year about the duration of my contract. And I knew that that conversation was going to come up again in this next meeting. So to my surprise, 2 days before that meeting was due to happen, the leadership of our group canceled the meeting due to concerns of coronavirus. And we were also quite surprised. At that time, there were no cases in Malawi. And again, the sort of conversations around the global lockdown hadn't happened. And I was told that one of the reasons was that this meeting was taking place in a Chinese-owned hotel, and there were concerns about previous international travelers that had used that hotel. Anyway, I saw it as God's provision for me of getting out of that rather awkward conversation around the end of my contract, so I was actually quite grateful at the time. The following Friday, I received an email again from my employers. Now, I was working for an American-based NGO, and this was really an email that was forwarded from the American embassy because most of the other expatriates working for this group were Americans, and so they were linked with the American embassy. And so this email stated that it strongly advised all expatriates in Malawi to leave the country soon as possible. It advised that virus pandemic and the consequences of it. And I think that part of it was certainly clear to me. And it also advised us that all medical evacuation flights would no longer be running alongside any other flights. So if we choose to stay, there would be no way to seek medical help outside of the country, and essentially we would be left on our own. So that was my first indicator that sort of things were getting serious. 2 days later, we received another email, again from the US Embassy, and this one was even more strongly worded. Instead of advising us to strongly leave, this email now strongly advised all expatriates to leave immediately or soon as possible. And it noted that the US had moved to a level 4 warning, which apparently is the warning that the US uses when it is at war with another country. Needless to say, the leadership of my organization took this quite seriously, and the next day I heard that 7 of our leadership team, I think there were a total of 9 or 10 Americans living in Lilongwe running the organization I was working for, 7 of them were leaving the country. And they called me wanting to know, was I leaving or not? The only other American colleague who was on my immediate team in the town where I was working was already out of the country and was not able to come back. 3 days later, I also heard that 2 American missionary families in the town where I was living were also leaving the town. And as there was another American missionary family that had already left several months earlier, it essentially left 3 families and myself. We were the expatriates that were remaining behind in this sort of small town where I was working. It was made clear to me that I was free to leave at any time. In fact, my employers were actually encouraging me to leave. But if I stayed, I was staying on my own terms. My insurance wouldn't cover me, and I was on my own. Yeah, these are just some images of our hospital. So I was very aware of the inadequacies of our system. I'd been working in this particular hospital for about 1.5 years. And every morning in the morning report, we had reports of people who had died from various preventable diseases. Often the cause of their death had been because various parts of the health system had not functioned very well, or problems with leadership, problems with communication, etc. In particular, with relation to the coronavirus story, our only supply of oxygen was these electric operated oxygen concentrators, as you can see in the picture on the right side. We had 5 of those working in the hospital. There was no wall oxygen of any form. And I think we had 1 oxygen cylinder, which we sort of really never used because most of the time it wasn't full. And if you did need to fill it, it required a 6-hour round trip to the city. So it wasn't really a very practical thing to use in our context. So we just had these 5 oxygen concentrator machines. We also had quite unreliable electricity supply. And there was a very small backup generator that was used predominantly for the operating theater and not really for anything else in the hospital. And in fact, in the country as a whole, there were only 17 ventilators in the whole of Malawi, including the public and the private sector, the very small private sector. So I didn't really need to be very convinced that the Malawi health system sort of was not going to cope with, certainly with the description of the pandemic that was being given to us in March. So that night I had dinner at a friend's house. He was working for a malaria vaccine project. And as we were having dinner together, he has a television. I didn't have a television at that point. And so we ended up watching the news and the BBC News. And it was at that time, it was my first time really to sort of see any television footage of what was going on. It was at that time in March that the crisis in Italy, in northern Italy, was raging. And there were these images like on the screen of people in these transparent bubble masks. And the BBC had, in particular, had an interview with the doctor who said, 2 weeks ago, it was basically his message to the world. 2 weeks ago, we were also complacent. We didn't think that this was coming, but we now want to tell the world what is about to come. And then the BBC interviewer went on to say, 2 weeks after this particular interview with this doctor, he died. And I think it was at that moment, for the first time, that I felt the full implications of what was happening, and I felt afraid. And I have to say, I did not sleep well that night. So the decision to stay seemed clear to me. In some ways, it felt like there wasn't really a decision to make. I felt like I'd already made that decision maybe 20 years earlier when I said yes to working in these mission situations, working cross-culturally, following God to such places. I'd been in dangerous places before. I'd spent some weeks in Afghanistan at some point. I'd worked on a few occasions with Samaritan's Purse in emergency settings. And in fact, Samaritan's Purse had offered me the chance to go and work at a COVID hospital in Italy during this time. And if I hadn't felt that I was more needed in Malawi, I probably would have signed up to do that. And so how on earth then could I run away from Malawi or not do it in Malawi when I was sort of willing to sign up for other places? But perhaps maybe more to the point, how could I leave my Malawian colleagues, my Malawian community, friends, and the country as a whole in what at least seemed at that point maybe the greatest hour of need? And I also thought stories that I had read before about those who had left Rwanda during the genocide, and the courage of the few workers who had chosen to stay behind in that period. These were the thoughts that were going to my head. And so while I felt afraid, it just didn't seem the right time to leave. But still, I woke up afraid on Saturday morning, and I realized that all my supervisors have left, their airports are closing, they are not going to be able to help me, and actually they're not coming to help me. So I'm sort of in this on my own, or at least the few people I had around me. I was not completely alone. Now, at that time, it certainly felt like we had very little resources. You know, I remember all of these messages of people saying, "Oh, be safe, be safe." And what was going through my mind is like, how can I stay safe? It just didn't seem possible to implement many of these things. So the hospital, almost on a daily basis, did not have running water. And actually, I spent the following week trying to buy about 100 buckets and taps to put in the hospital just so we could wash our hands. But on that Saturday morning, my thought was not so much for the hospital. At that point, it was for myself, and how do I protect myself? Now, there was all of this talk about hand sanitizer, but there wasn't actually any hand sanitizer to buy anywhere, even in the cities, and we were 3.5 hours away from a city. But the WHO had produced a recipe of making hand sanitizer from methylated spirits and glycerine. So we had plenty of glycerine in our town, and we also had methylated spirits. It was used for cooking. So I went on a bit of a buying spree, fearing a stock out, as I thought everybody would be doing the same. I went and bought about 30 bottles of methylated spirits and similar quantities of glycerine, and then a few of us sort of sat and made up a few bottles of our own homemade hand sanitizer. There was a South African family who are doing Bible translation in the area, and they said they had some masks that they had left over from a construction project. So in total, I had 4 N95 masks, and I had potentially 30 bottles of hand sanitizer. You just really couldn't buy or find anything else at that time. So that was my plan. That was my protection plan. So the next day was a Sunday, and I woke up and I went for a bike ride in the morning, as I often do, and I put on a podcast. And this is the podcast that I listened to. It's actually from the UK's CMF, but I think a similar podcast has been given also on the ICMDA platform, which is our parent body for the Christian Medical and Dental Fellowships. And it was really listening to this podcast that changed everything for me in the next few months. It really spoke very deeply for me. It's a podcast by Professor John Wyatt, who's a professor of neonatology in the UK. I actually had the chance to meet him and a few conversations with him 2 years ago at the India conference. So it was particularly nice to hear words from somebody that I'd sort of had some contact with already. And I can really recommend actually the first speaker spoke about how do we encourage ourselves in the Lord. So I can really recommend this particular talk, actually, as certainly it had this powerful impact for me. So Professor White was speaking about sacrificial love and started off using the story of Jesus washing the feet and of his disciples before his crucifixion, and sort of what a humble and demeaning and self-giving task that was. And he went on to speak about how Christians in the past had responded to plagues. So he gave a bit of the history of plagues and went on to speak about how Christians in the past had responded to plagues, such as caring for people that had been literally left out by other people or their families to die in the streets, that at times the carers themselves had contracted the same disease of the people that they were caring for, and at times had even died themselves. And so this talk, as I was cycling, also led me to think about the missionary graves that were not far from where I was living in Malawi, in Cape Maclear. In fact, John White also made reference to this in his talk about people who, in the turn of the century, had been willing to come on missionary work and had even taken coffins with them. There's several of these graves in Malawi where a few of them, whole families, had died shortly after arriving in the country of malaria and other diseases. Anyway, as I listened to this talk and I was reflecting on this, I realized that I was part of a long legacy of Christian doctors who had been there before me and who had already worked out what we should do. They had already worked it out for me and left an example of what to do. It was very clear they lived the truth of caring for people with their lives. And if they died, they had been willing to die. Now, while it might sound strange or even heroic at this point, something inside of me deeply resonated with this message that day. And I knew what I had to do. I was no longer afraid to die. If others had suffered for their faith, why not me? If others had been willing even to die for what they believed in, why not me? Was I not willing to be in their number? I came home that day to my housemate, Kondwani, and said to him, Mesho, we called each other Mesho. He said, Mesho, let's live out our faith. That sort of became our motto or our war cry for the next few months. Let's live out our faith. And we would say it often to each other. So that same afternoon, it was a Sunday, we had our weekly missionary fellowship meeting. As I said, there were not many of us left by that point, but here we were. This group is really an amazing group of people and have been so inspiring to me over the last 2 years, people that I really consider heroes in the faith. And you can see we were sitting outside under the trees, and the person sharing this day, he's actually, I think, not in this photograph, is Joel, who has been involved in translating the scriptures into the Yao language. He's Yao himself for about 10, 15 years, I think. So he's a Bible translator. And he was sharing the message at this fellowship group this morning. Or that afternoon, I said, we met in the afternoon. So the word that he shared that afternoon really went straight into my soul. And it really was a message for me at that time. And he was sharing from the book of Habakkuk. Now, if you have never read the book of Habakkuk, I want to encourage you to spend some time there. For me personally, I say the minor prophets have always been a series of books that have really resonated with me deeply and spoke to me deeply. I love their radical nature, and I love the fact that they are prepared to deal with the social and the political issues in their time. Habakkuk itself is both a discomforting book and it's also a comforting book in some times. It's a series of questions that the prophet Habakkuk asks God, and it also records God's rather unexpected answers to Habakkuk. It was written in a time of great uncertainty in Israel, great fear, great confusion, with a lot of corruption. And the book of Habakkuk starts with Habakkuk's first complaint towards God, where he says, How long, O God, must I cry for help, but you do not listen? Or I cry out to you violence, but you do not save. This image, by the way, is just also our Mangoshi missionary group as we're standing on the hill just praying for the town as on the way back from a different fellowship meeting. So I thought it was relevant alongside Habakkuk's prayer to God. So he cried out, how long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. And that Sunday, I could relate to Habakkuk's question. God, where are you? Why are you not listening? Why are you not saving? In Habakkuk's time, there was so much corruption in the land, so many problems. It seemed as if God was not doing anything. And that's how it somewhat seemed in the time of the coronavirus as well. Now, God's answer to Habakkuk is actually even more disturbing. First of all, he says, look at the nations. This is now God replying back to Habakkuk. He says, look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. In fact, you could say something unprecedented, which was certainly true for our times. But what is it actually that God said to Habakkuk that he would do? What was this thing that he was to watch, look at the nations and watch and see what God was going to do? Surprisingly, God said that he was going to raise up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people. The Babylonians, who were ruthless enemies of Israel, who would attack Israel, who would ultimately come to destroy everything, including their capital in Jerusalem. God's answer was that he was using something actually even worse, the attack of a cruel nation, to bring change. Habakkuk was shocked. Could God really be using the Babylonians? How could God use something so bad, so cruel? I suppose in my mind, I was asking the question, can God be using the coronavirus? Or where is God in this situation? Is God still in control? And so that led to Habakkuk's second question to God. I'll read the whole thing. It says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? And why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Why are you silent, God? Really what Habakkuk is asking here is, God, how can you use a nation that is so wicked? And why does it that you seem silent? And this question was so disturbing to Habakkuk that he actually declares later on his expectation of God to bring an answer and how he waits on God to bring an answer. In chapter 2, he says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts, and I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. He was ready for God to answer. And I must say, I also felt ready that Saturday for God to answer, God, where are you in this? What next comes is a verse that is also often quite quoted, but I think quite possibly out of context. God is really trying to underline the importance of the message that he's bringing across to Habakkuk, where he says, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. So what was this revelation that God was replying to Habakkuk's question about? Amongst other verses, this is the one that stood out to me. He says, see, The enemy is puffed up, the enemy being the Babylonians at that point. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by faith, will live by his faith. This verse at that point just struck a real deep place inside of me. It was similar to the message that I heard this morning. Let's live out our faith. Let's live by faith in this time. Faith that God is in control, even when it seems that he isn't in control. God's response was that he saw how wicked the Babylonians were, but they too would perish. But in the light of the bad times, his people were to live by faith, and they were to believe that God was still for them, even when he seemed silent. This interaction and these sort of series of questions, of prayers and answers to Habakkuk led in chapter 3 to some of the most beautiful prayers, I think, in Scripture. And I'm just going to, some of them will be familiar. And I think we'd be good to reflect on this a bit and maybe even incorporate this into some of our own prayers. Chapter 3 begins, Lord, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day. In our time, Lord, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Other translations say, Lord, would you renew them in our day? It's a prayer for renewal. It's a prayer for revival, in fact. And then, towards the end of the book, this beautiful poem, the book concludes with this poem. Though the fig tree does not bud, and though there are no grapes on the vines, and though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, and though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will be joyful in God my Savior. We left the fellowship meeting that day deeply encouraged. Now, years earlier, Kondwani, my housemate, had painted a painting of a baobab tree. He was a bit of an artist guy. So he painted this picture of a baobab tree that was based on this verse from Habakkuk 3, verse 17 to 18. So there were many of these enormous trees in Mangochi, in Malawi, where I was living. And most of the year that they are very dry, with no leaves or fruit. In the rainy season, they come to life for a short few months. They have leaves and these large sausage-shaped fruit. And this painting of the baobab, as you can see, has Habakkuk 3, verse 17 painted beneath it. This we saw as the fig tree that was not budding, this dry tree. So we took this painting at that point. It was just being stored in a part of the house. We took it out of the cupboard. We put it in a prominent place on the bookshelf. So it reminded us every time we walked in and out of the house. And it stayed with us for the entire duration, actually, until I left, as being a reminder of what we had felt God had said to us on that day. So there were some other scriptures that deeply encouraged me on this time. This one is the story from Daniel in the fiery furnace, which actually made me think of an episode when our hospital pharmacy caught fire. This picture on the right is the pharmacy that actually burned to the ground. That was in about September last year, and destroyed 3 months of drugs with it. But anyway, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this was the story of these three when they were about to be thrown into the fiery furnace. They said, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the image of gold that you have set up. The message was the same. The challenge is to have faith that God is still for you, even when circumstances say otherwise. A few weeks later, at the same missionary fellowship, this one was actually at my house. So if you want to sort of see how we were living in Malawi, that was sort of like the little courtyard area in my house, and that was our group at that point. And in this particular afternoon, we were looking at the issue of laments. Now, I think this idea has, I think sort of there's many churches that have been drawn to look at the issue of lament. So this might be familiar to some people in this group, but in particular, we listen to this podcast you've got in the right-hand side there. So about 1/3 of the Psalms are actually Psalms of lament. And so laments themselves are a form of worship. And this, I think, I first became clear of when I was reading a beautiful little book by Matt Redman called The Heart of a Worshipper. And he reflects on a time when he was in America shortly after the 9/11 attack on the buildings in New York City. And he was reflecting how the church at that time needed to be singing more songs of lament, that how much of our worship was not really maybe expressing what was really in the hearts of people. And yet the Bible has a lot actually of this expression of worship. And the podcast that we listened to sort of examined various Psalms and broke down 3 parts, saying that laments really comprise of 3 things. And I think this was really helpful to me. Part of the exercise was to try and use this in our own devotional time. The first thing is that there's a complaint. And this is similar to Habakkuk's question, how long, O Lord? Why does it seem that you're so silent? Why is it that bad things keep happening and it seems like nothing is happening? There's a complaint. And the second part of a lament is a request. God, we're asking you to come and do this. Come and bring an end to the suffering. Come and bring justice in this world. And the third part of a lament is a statement of trust in the character of God. So those are the 3 components of most laments that are in the Psalms. They start with a complaint, they move to a request, and they end in a statement of trust. And it was this sentence actually in this talk that really spoke to me at that point, where it says a complaint attacks and doubts the character of God. And that is really what the Israelites did as they were walking through the wilderness following Moses. Whereas a lament reminds God of his character and faithfulness. There's always a statement somewhere in a lament that's reminding both the writer and God of his character and faithfulness. And of course, the book of Habakkuk itself is a lament. It has all of those components of a lament. So lamenting is more than a technique for venting emotion. It's one of the fruits of a deepening spiritual life that has learned to stand naked before God without shame or pretense. In fact, long before Gethsemane, Jesus himself had pronounced that those who mourn are blessed. Implicit in this statement is that those who do not mourn will not be comforted, and those who do not face endings will not receive new beginnings. And that very much spoke to me as I was considering the end of 10 years working in Malawi and saying goodbye to a whole lot of strong friendships and strong community. Now, I remember one other thing that spoke to me during this time as we watched this film about the life of Mother Teresa, which I can also strongly recommend. And it really touched me in a way much deeper than I had expected. And there were lots of aspects of her story that I really didn't know. And I think some things that really stood out for me is how much she stood in prayer when things went wrong for her, when she was treated unfairly, and particularly when she had difficult situations within the church and sort of the plea that she was making with the church to allow her to continue her ministry to the poor. But what really came to my surprise was how many times she felt as if God had abandoned her, and she was very lonely. And there are many, many things in her writings where this came out, this strong, saintly woman of God. And I felt God speak to me at that point saying, don't be surprised when you walk through these dark times. There are many other men and women of God who have walked this journey. So there were many, many other things that happened during that time. Of course, our hospital got ready to prepare for the influx of patients for coronavirus. We had a tent set up where we were going to do the sort of the screening process. We did, in fact, do the screening process. We did eventually receive supplies of PPE, and then we sort of had difficult conversations about how best we were going to use them and who was going to get and how long we were going to use them for, because we were aware that although we had a lot, it wasn't unlimited. We had a nursing strike because the government had given danger pay or risk allowance to certain categories of workers, but other groups of nurses were not included. So they went on strike for about a week. Then we had sort of Malawi's rather brief experiment with a lockdown. In April, the government proposed a relatively strict lockdown where people would not really be allowed out of their homes, markets would be closed, and as healthcare workers, we were going to have to get traveling permits. So I spent quite a few days trying to find out how we were going to get these permits. It was extremely unclear. And then basically a day before this lockdown was about to start, opposition groups took the government to court, and the court actually ruled that the lockdown was unconstitutional and would not go ahead. So we never had a lockdown. That was our lockdown was sort of in threat only. Anyway, so that was our brief experiment with lockdown. And then we had this phenomenon of large numbers of Malawians coming back from South Africa on buses. There were probably, while I was there, probably about 4 or 5 convoys of buses that brought several thousand people back from South Africa to Malawi. Of course, in South Africa, most people had lost their jobs, lost sources of income. And even in my town, we were faced with this bizarre situation of rural Malawians actually sending money from Malawi to their relatives in South Africa, where for years, obviously the money had flowed the other way. Now we had people in rural areas who were sending money to their relatives in South African cities just to keep people alive and give people money to buy food. And what was problematic, you can see from the top that on surveys, 15% and another 12% of people coming home were testing positive for coronavirus. So Malawi didn't really have many cases at that point, but in a sense, we were importing large numbers of cases with people coming back, which was not really very well managed. There was not really any quarantine and people were just sent home. So these were some of the issues that we were dealing with as a nation. And personally, of course, I had some of my own issues. The conversation that I had successfully avoided in March came back to me in late May, and it really became clear to me that my contract was going to end. And so I had to look for another job and found indeed a job back in South Africa, and then began the process of a repatriation flight. Our flight date was changed 3 times. And eventually we left on this charter plane. It was a 50-seater plane, and we were only 9 people on this plane. And we were met in Joburg by a police escort, complete with blue flashing lights, and we're escorted by a police escort to our quarantine hotel. And there's me sitting in my hotel room, obviously not looking very happy and a little bit shocked at sort of where have I come now. I'm just back in South Africa, but I'm not really back because I'm just locked in this room for 10 days. It was supposed to be 14 days, but I sort of ran away after 10 days. That's another bit of a story. Anyway, as much as that was a bit of a traumatic process, certainly the quarantine period really did give me a chance to also reflect and pray and slow down a bit. And one of the books that I read during that quarantine period, I think also speaks really to what I'm trying to say. And there's this book called God on Mute. And I thought it was also a little bit ironic, because lots of us are on Zoom calls at the moment, and I think lots of us have had this experience of saying, you know, unmute yourself, we can't hear you. And maybe sometimes that's what we would like to say to God, you know, God, can you please unmute yourself? We are not really hearing what you have to say. So that's what this book was about. It seems, what do we do when it seems God has gone on mute? And it's really a book that looks at the paradox of unanswered prayer. And I can also recommend this book quite strongly. It's a very practical and very honest book. It's not sort of full of deep lofty theology. It's really full of people's stories and grappling with individual people's stories. And there's a few quotes from this that I just want to put out there that really struck me as I was reading this book. So this is the first one. Laying down our lives rarely feels or looks heroic. Instead, it takes the mundane form of a daily struggle. And that's certainly how it felt for me during most of those months. This one was from Francis Schaeffer. It says, I must ask very gently, is it not time that our prayers for ourselves are almost entirely aimed at getting rid of the negative at any cost, rather than praying that the negatives be faced in the proper attitude? And then lastly, this thought, we cannot remove Gethsemane and Golgotha from the reality of life in Christ. We do need a theology of suffering. So the very last thing I want to close with is this poem that somebody sent me quite early on in March, in sort of the lockdown and even the sort of fear before the lockdown period. It's also a lament, I suppose, reflecting on God and a prayer for God to come to our shut down places. And it starts off with a reflection on Hannah, and how Hannah, the mother of Samuel, and you may remember that Eli found Hannah in the temple crying out to God because she was unable to conceive. And the scripture actually said that God closed her womb. So it was her womb was an image, in a sense, of a shut down place. And so this poem starts from that point, and I'll just read this in closing. It does not come easy for us to imagine that you closed the womb of Hannah, and thereby foreclosed the future for a time. And yet, we can name in your presence a myriad of shut down places around us. Those shut down in poverty and despair. Those shut down in fear and rage. Those shut down by abuse and violence. Too hurt to speak. Too frightened to appear. Too scarred to dance. And yet closer, our own shutdowns in anxiety, in resentment, in pretense, too weary to care, too greedy to share, too much of us for our neighbor. These things are not your doing, we confess, but you are a God who opens all shutdowns. By your power, you give futures. By your goodness, you give hope. By your mercy, you make new. So we bid you this day, come to our shut down places and give birth anew. We pray for the Easter opening of the Friday shutdown. Amen. So Augustine asked me, I think we're going into small groups next, so I will hand over now, I think, back to Stuart, but these are just some questions you can consider in your small groups, or if you also want to take the discussion somewhere else, that's also fine, but these are some suggestions maybe to get you talking